In April 1982, as icy winds swept across the South Atlantic, Britain sailed into a war it did not expect to fight and did not fully understand. The Royal Navy, trained for decades to confront Soviet submarines and missile fleets in the North Atlantic, suddenly found itself steaming toward a remote chain of islands thousands of miles from home, facing an enemy most British planners underestimated from the very beginning. Argentina was not supposed to be able to challenge one of the world's most professional navies. Its aircraft were older, its pilots largely untested in modern naval combat, and its resources limited by distance and logistics. Yet hidden inside those assumptions was a fatal flaw, because Argentina possessed one weapon that perfectly matched the geography, weather, and vulnerabilities of the British task force, the A-4 Skyhawk. Small, fast enough, and capable of carrying heavy bombs, the Skyhawk was never designed to fight a modern fleet protected by missiles and radar. But war does not always reward design intentions. It rewards timing, courage, and opportunity. As British ships moved south toward the Falkland Islands, confidence remained high. Sea Harriers would intercept attackers. Shipborne missiles would finish anything that slipped through. The idea that low-flying jets could break through layered defenses and sink modern warships seemed almost absurd. But the South Atlantic was not a NATO exercise zone. Weather-cluttered radar screens, sea spray masked targets, low clouds blurred horizons, and the Argentine pilots knew exactly how to exploit every weakness. Flying at wave-top height, sometimes less than 50 feet above the water, Skyhawks approached undetected until the last possible seconds. Radar operators often saw them only when they were already attacking. Missile systems designed for higher altitude targets struggled to lock on. Guns fired too late. In those final moments, everything depended on human reaction time. Argentine pilots flew missions that bordered on suicide. The distance from mainland bases to the Falklands pushed the Skyhawk to its absolute limits. Every sortie required precise navigation over open ocean, mid-air refueling, and perfect fuel management. A single error meant death in freezing water. There were no diversion airfields, no rescue helicopters waiting. Many pilots knew before takeoff that they might not return, yet they flew anyway. When the attacks began in earnest in May 1982, the Royal Navy was shocked. Bombs slammed into ships at near horizontal angles, sometimes failing to explode but still tearing through hulls, igniting fires and disabling systems. British sailors quickly learned that an unexploded bomb did not mean safety. Fire spread through aluminum superstructures. Electrical systems failed. Damage control teams fought desperately as ships lost power and steering. The illusion of naval invulnerability vanished almost overnight. Each successful Argentine attack forced the British to adapt tactics in real time, repositioning ships, altering formations, and pushing air defenses to their limits. Yet even as British commanders adjusted, the Skyhawks kept coming. The attacks were relentless, precise, and terrifyingly close. Pilots flew straight into missile fire, through tracer rounds and shrapnel, releasing bombs at mast height before pulling away at the last possible second. Some escaped with fuel gauges reading 0. Others were shot down within sight of their targets. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the psychological impact on the Royal Navy was profound. Calm seas and clear skies, once welcomed, became a source of dread because they favored low-level attackers. Every radar contact triggered tension. Every unidentified blip could mean another ship lost. By the time the war ended, It was clear that the A-4 Skyhawk had changed how the world viewed naval warfare, not through advanced technology, but through ruthless exploitation of vulnerability. The Falklands War proved that even modern fleets could be brought to the brink by determined pilots flying simple aircraft with deadly precision. Britain would ultimately prevail, but the cost was real, measured in ships sunk, sailors killed, and lessons learned under fire. The Skyhawks did not defeat the Royal Navy, but they shattered its assumptions, leaving behind a truth no navy could ignore. In war, underestimating your enemy can be more dangerous than lacking weapons. As May 1982 unfolded, the war around the Falkland Islands entered its most dangerous phase, and the illusion that the British fleet could control the air above it collapsed completely. Argentine planners understood that they could not win a prolonged campaign, so every attack had to count. Skyhawk squadrons were now launched with increasing urgency, often flying multiple sorties a day despite mounting losses. British ships clustered in narrow waters around San Carlos Bay to support the landings, presented a concentrated target environment that Argentine pilots immediately recognized as their best opportunity. The geography worked against the Royal Navy. High ground around the bay limited radar coverage, while hills and inlets allowed attacking aircraft to appear suddenly at extremely close range. When Skyhawks broke over the ridgelines and dropped into attack runs, British defenses had seconds, not minutes, to react. Missile systems struggled with minimum engagement distances. Radar locks were broken by terrain. Anti-aircraft guns fired frantically as jets streaked past at mast height. The attacks were chaotic, violent, and intensely personal. Pilots aimed, visually selecting ships by silhouette and position, often choosing the largest or most vulnerable target in a split second. Bombs slammed into hulls, detonating or not, but always leaving destruction behind. Fire spread through ships like living things, fed by fuel, ammunition, and aluminum superstructures. Damage control teams fought blindly in smoke-filled compartments, often without power or communications, trying to save ships that were already doomed. Argentine pilots paid a terrible price for these successes. Sea Harriers intercepted when they could, missiles found their marks, and anti-aircraft fire tore through formations. Many Skyhawks never made it back to the mainland, yet the attacks continued, driven by a belief among Argentine airmen that every ship hit mattered more than survival. British sailors began to recognize patterns in the attacks and adapted where possible. But fear crept into daily operations. Watches became longer. Fatigue set in. Every radar contact raised heart rates. The realization spread quietly through the fleet that technological superiority did not guarantee protection. Skill, timing, and courage could still penetrate even the most modern defenses. By the end of the San Carlos landings, the Royal Navy had survived, but it had been bloodied, shaken, and permanently changed. The Skyhawks had proven that a determined air force, even one flying outdated aircraft, could challenge a modern navy if it was willing to accept horrific losses. The next phase of the war would be fought with this knowledge burned into both sides. Britain now knew it was vulnerable, and Argentina knew it could strike again. By late May 1982, the Falklands War reached the moment that would permanently shatter Britain's sense of naval security, as a series of devastating ship losses proved that the Skyhawk threat was not theoretical, but lethal. The first shock came when British destroyers and frigates, operating close to shore to protect landing forces, found themselves trapped between geography and air attack. Argentine pilots targeted these ships with ruthless efficiency, flying directly into intense fire to release bombs at point-blank range. HMS Ardent was hit repeatedly during sustained attacks, her defenses overwhelmed by the sheer speed and proximity of the sky. Fire spread uncontrollably. Damage control teams fought until exhaustion, and eventually the ship had to be abandoned, becoming the first major Royal Navy surface combatant lost in action since World War II. The psychological impact was immediate. British sailors now understood that modern warships could burn and sink just as violently as those of earlier eras. Days later, HMS Antelope was struck by Argentine bombs that failed to detonate on impact. A grim reminder that survival after an attack did not guarantee safety. While specialists attempted to defuse the unexploded ordnance, one bomb detonated, ripping the ship apart from the inside. Antelope burned through the night and sank the following day, broadcast across the world in images that stunned a nation accustomed to naval dominance. Yet the most shocking blow came with the loss of HMS Coventry, positioned alongside HMS Broadsword to act as an air defense picket. Coventry was designed to destroy incoming aircraft before they could reach the fleet. On May 25th, Argentine A-4 Skyhawks approached at low altitude, exploiting terrain and timing with devastating precision. Missile systems failed to engage effectively. In seconds, bombs struck Coventry, capsizing her as fires tore through the hull. The ship rolled and sank in less than 20 minutes, killing 19 sailors and leaving survivors clinging to wreckage in freezing water. The loss of Coventry was more than a tactical defeat. It was a national shock. It happened on the same day Britain celebrated Navy Day, amplifying the sense of disbelief at home. Each sinking forced the Royal Navy to confront uncomfortable truths about ship design, air defense limitations, and the vulnerability of surface fleets to low-level attack. Sailors began to speak openly about fear, something rarely admitted in elite naval culture. Argentine pilots, meanwhile, paid an extraordinary price for these successes. Many Skyhawks were shot down during or after their attacks, fuel exhausted, aircraft damaged beyond recovery, pilots lost to the sea. Victory came at the cost of lives that Argentina could not easily replace. Yet the damage inflicted was undeniable. British commanders adjusted tactics, pulling ships farther offshore, tightening air defenses, and relying even more heavily on carrier-based fighters. But the damage to ships, to morale, to assumptions had already been done. The sinkings proved that the Royal Navy was not immune to determined air attack, and that courage, timing, and exploitation of weakness could overcome superior technology. When the war ended weeks later with British victory on land, it was clear that success had come at a price far higher than anticipated. The A-4 Skyhawks had not won the war for Argentina, but they had rewritten the rules of modern naval combat, leaving Britain and the world with a lesson paid for in steel, fire, and lives lost at sea. As the wreckage of British ships smoldered in the cold South Atlantic, attention slowly turned to the men who had made those attacks possible, the Argentine pilots who flew the A-4 Skyhawks into what many of them openly described as near certain death. These were not reckless amateurs, nor were they elite jet aces raised on cutting-edge technology. Many were young officers in their 20s, trained rigorously but forced to fight with aircraft that lacked modern radar, electronic countermeasures, or long-range navigation systems. Their missions demanded a level of precision and nerve that bordered on the impossible, flying hundreds of miles over open ocean, often guided by little more than stopwatches, compasses, and memory. They descended to wave-top height to avoid radar detection. At that altitude, A single mistake, a moment of inattention, a sudden gust of wind, a misjudged wave could send an aircraft into the sea. Yet they pressed on, knowing that once they crossed the British defensive perimeter, survival depended entirely on seconds. Pilots described attack runs where tracer fire stitched the air around them. Missiles flashed past, and ship superstructures filled their windscreens at terrifying speed. There was no time for hesitation. Bombs had to be released at exactly the right moment, low enough to hit but high enough to arm, before pulling away under maximum throttle. Many pilots later admitted they did not expect to survive their first combat sortie. Some did not. Entire squadrons suffered losses that would have grounded most air forces, yet replacements volunteered without hesitation. For these men, the war was not abstract. It was personal, driven by a belief that every successful hit mattered, that every ship damage shortened the conflict or strengthened Argentina's position. British sailors, too, recognized the courage of their attackers, often expressing a reluctant respect for pilots who flew straight into defensive fire without flinching. After the war, British officers would acknowledge that the Skyhawk pilot's skill and determination were among the most formidable threats the fleet had ever faced. The human cost on both sides was immense. Argentine air units lost dozens of aircraft and highly trained pilots they could not replace, while British ships lost sailors trapped by fire, smoke, and flooding deep below decks. The Falklands War was brief, but for those who fought it in the air and at sea, it compressed fear, bravery, and loss into moments that would define the rest of their lives. The Skyhawk attacks were not just tactical events. They were human collisions between young men following orders, trusting training, and confronting mortality at supersonic speed. Long after the last shots were fired, veterans on both sides would remember not the strategies or political arguments, but the sound of engines screaming low over the waves, the flash of explosions, and the knowledge that survival often came down to chance measured in seconds. When the Falklands War ended in June 1982 with British forces reclaiming the islands, victory came with relief but also with a deep, lasting unease that spread quietly through naval circles around the world. Britain had won on land, yet at sea the war had exposed vulnerabilities that no modern navy could afford to ignore. The A-4 Skyhawks, flown by pilots with limited technology and almost no margin for error, had demonstrated that surface fleets, even those protected by missiles, radar, and professional doctrine, were far more fragile than previously believed. The Royal Navy immediately began rethinking everything: ship design, air defense doctrine, electronic warfare, damage control, and the balance between carriers, escorts, and aircraft. Aluminium superstructures were re-evaluated after fires proved impossible to contain. Missile systems were scrutinized for minimum engagement ranges that left ships exposed at close quarters. Training shifted toward defending against low-level high-speed attacks rather than distant high-altitude threats. Other navies watched closely. The Falklands became a case study taught in war colleges across the world, not as a story of British triumph alone, but as a warning about complacency. Technology, it turned out, was only as effective as the assumptions behind it. Argentina had lost the war, but its pilots had forced a global reckoning. Their attacks proved that courage, tactical insight, and willingness to exploit weaknesses could partially offset overwhelming material disadvantage. At the same time, the human cost underscored the brutal truth of modern warfare. Success achieved through desperation carries unbearable losses. Many Argentine pilots never returned. Many British sailors never went home. The South Atlantic claimed them without regard for flags or politics. In the decades since, historians have debated strategies and decisions, but one lesson remains uncontested. The Skyhawks did not sink Britain's resolve, but they sank Britain's certainty. They reminded the world that no fleet is invulnerable, no doctrine permanent, and no war as clean or predictable as planners hope. In that cold ocean, in 1982, amid smoke, fire, and courage on both sides, modern naval warfare was rewritten not by the most advanced machines, but by men flying low over dark water, proving that underestimation can be as deadly as any weapon.